Hey everybody, this is Jerry. So I have a special guest. This is Christina Snyder, and she taught me Native American history back when I was at Penn. So I've been in touch with her for many years after I took her class, and it's just been amazing that I got back in touch with her, and now I have her on as a guest, and I'm sure you guys will love the stuff, the research she's been doing. In fact, she has a new book coming out. So welcome, Christina.
Thanks so much for having me, Jerry. It's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just tell you, I think I've told my viewers this, but when I was at Penn, I was so lost. And then I randomly signed up for your class that last semester you were teaching there. And then that class changed my life because it brought the intellectualism back into my life. And I met Pablo, the Mayan guy who was really scholarly. And it just it prevented me from going down a bad hole because I was going to join a frat and everything. I was going to be screw education, just have fun. So I thank your class. I thank the fact that luck just had it that I signed up for your class that semester.
Oh, that's such a huge compliment. I mean, it's really gratifying to hear stuff like that. At the time, I had actually just graduated from earning my PhD, and I was still pretty young. So, it's just, I don't know, it always makes my day when I hear that my teaching changed somebody's point of view.
And listen to you talk now, I realize you have a little Southern accent, right? So you must have grown up in the South.
I did. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, so that's right in the middle of the state. And it actually really, I don't think I would have been a historian if I hadn't grown up there.
Oh, interesting.
So basically, I got interested in history because, I think Macon is a place where people they know that history matters, right? It shapes people's everyday realities. And I think the history that they usually think about is antebellum, then the Civil War era, and later on the Civil Rights era. And but there is also a lot of Native American history there. It's home to some of North America's largest mounds, Native American mounds. So it was really a Native American city before it was a U.S. city.
Wow.
And so I was really interested in that, and I was interested in why we didn't talk about it in schools. So basically, my academic career has been about trying to connect those native-centered stories to the more well-known narratives that we know about U.S. history, right? Because I think that the native part is something that all Americans should know.
Exactly. I agree. And I remember the most mind-blowing thing this still gets to me this day. When I was taking your class and I saw the city Cahokia, this is a different population of Native Americans, the Pueblo Indians, but I remember I was like, what? They had cities? Why didn't we learn about it? And I showed all my friends, I showed my parents, and my parents, their minds were blown because, my parents Chinese, their perception of Native Americans is Pocahontas and what mainstream media shows. So they're like, what? They had cities before even we knew. It's so that's something that blew my mind, and it shows how much of the narrative just isn't known for many Americans.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Pueblos had cities in the Southwest, and Cahokia was a huge city in the Midwest. And I think that you're right that most Americans, no matter what their background is, most of the information they have about Native people is from popular culture, whether that's Disney or commercials or maybe old Westerns. And most of that is really just stuff that's fabricated by non-Indians. Yeah. So it's overall, it's not very good information. So I think that's why we need history, right? To get these narratives out there that reveal something that's more true about the past.
Exactly. It's something I've talked a lot about with sort of my parents and just with people who are interested in history. But whether you can get to the complete truth in history is probably something for debate. But the more views you get, the more archaeological evidence, the more sort of primary, secondary sources you can gather from the era, the closer you can get to the truth. And then there's just a whole lots of views that are just missing from the American narrative because maybe through oral tradition, a lot of it was lost, or maybe some of the, the archaeological stuff was just covered up and still needs to be dug up. So, I'm glad there are people who are studying this, because, I'll be honest, when I took your class, I almost thought maybe I should study Native American history too, because it fascinated me so much. So, I'm glad there are people like that, and I wish there were more people. And maybe one day, if my YouTube career doesn't work out, I'll become a historian that studies Native American history too.
That's great. I think, no matter what you do, if you decide to go to graduate school and be an intellectual, or if you're just like teaching this to other people, or to, eventually one day if you have kids, that we can change the way that people think about our country's past. And I think you're right that the more perspectives that we have, the more informed we are. I actually tell my students in class that history is kind of like experiencing a car wreck, right? Car wrecks are probably something that like everybody has experienced at some point, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing is, like, the wreck happened. Like, the fact that the wreck happened is a historical fact, right? Mm-hmm. It can be documented. But what exactly caused it depends on where you're sitting, right? So, like, if there's some kind of blame that needs to go around, people might view it differently, right? The driver versus the person who was hit versus a passenger or just somebody who's walking by. Like, they're all going to have different perspectives on this event. Yeah. So I think, if we compare that to history, to say like a war, for example, we'll get a fuller story if we have more views of the participants, right? And I think you're right that sometimes that requires going to different sources, whether that's historical documents or archaeology or oral history. And luckily, I think scholars are doing more interdisciplinary work, and historians are like more open to non-textual documents, things like the archaeology, or even things like climate data.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Or genetic data even. I remember, he's very, very debated, and I would love to get him on my show eventually. But when Jared Diamond came out with Guns, Germs, and Steel, that like changed historians a lot. But then a lot of historians got mad at him for, you're being all deterministic. You're not taking care of individual agency like you should. So, but like, I think he definitely contributed to now historians think about, they might even bring in game theory. They might even bring in genetic data and plant DNA data and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, his conclusions are definitely, I would say, very controversial, but you're right, like his methods are something that can be useful. And I think that's one good thing about reading different kinds of scholarship, is that you might disagree with the conclusions, but you might get some good pointers from the methods.
Yeah.
So,
tell me about your new book. What got you started in it, and how did it evolve, and then where is it now?
Okay, so the book just came out, which is exciting. It came out on March 1st of this year. It's called Great Crossings, Indian Settlers and Slaves in the Age of Jackson. And it came out with Oxford. You can get on Amazon or lots of different outlets. But basically, I got interested in this story because this was a community that was based around the first federally controlled Indian boarding school. So the first one controlled by the U.S. government and not by like a missionary society. And it was very early. It was from the 1820s to the 1840s. And I was interested in the school because a lot of famous Native American leaders who later became chiefs went to this school. And what made it even more interesting was that it was on a plantation. Wow. So there are actually free and enslaved African Americans who lived and worked there too, and some of them were even secretly educated at this school. Wow. So it's I think it's a look at antebellum America that we don't typically get. It's one where you can really see Indian settlers and slaves all interacting, living close to each other, being in conflict or sometimes being in collaboration. And it's interesting because it actually started off as a really hopeful kind of project where people were coming together and thinking about a multiracial America, that in contrast to some of the later Indian boarding schools, this one was actually voluntary.
Wow.
And Native nations paid almost all the expenses, so tuition, fees, things like that. And they selected mostly elite boys, and it was an all-boys school, to go there because they figured, we have to live with the U.S. We want people who can speak English, who can really, speak it and read it well enough to make treaties, and sign legal documents and things like that. So, and Native people thought, we've been living with whites in this continent for centuries, and we want to find a peaceful way forward, and so I think it came out of this kind of project of hope. And in terms of African Americans who were there, they wanted emancipation. There was a big emancipation movement in Kentucky, which is where the school was. And they thought that by kind of learning American values, by kind of displaying middle class values, that they could be respectable, that they could join this republic too. And basically, this is a really hopeful place, but it falls apart in the age of Jackson because I argue that this is, an age of escalating racism that really makes this project impossible. So it falls apart. And so I see the Jacksonian era not one as, the expansion of freedom and liberty. I think that really only makes sense if you look at white men.
Yeah, exactly.
The totality of America, which is women and lots of people of color from different backgrounds, that narrative just doesn't make sense. And in fact, it was a real narrowing of opportunity for those people. So that's basically an overview of the book.
Wow. And do you then explore what happens after the Jackson era, or is the core of the book about the changes that happened during the Jackson era?
There are a couple of chapters that cover what happens after, because the book, it's kind of a big story, but I wanted to latch on to certain figures, to see what happened to them. So I really follow them up until the 1880s, roughly. And it's interesting because with the Native Americans, they go to school here, they become literate, and lots of them become really prolific writers. So I have a lot of diaries, letters, things like that from Native Americans. Yeah, which is pretty rare in this era. And that's one of the things that made the project so fun. And then there are African Americans there who also read and write. And their voices are actually a little bit more difficult to discover, partially because some of that documentation has been destroyed. But I was actually able to do oral history interviews with some of their descendants, or get a hold of other kinds of documents that helped me learn what happened to them. How did they try to make lives after emancipation and the Civil War? So I kind of ended it in the late 19th century, but I do look forward to today. That basically, I think this might be really obvious now, but that our story, the story of the U.S., isn't necessarily one of progress. It's often really cyclical, in the same way that the Jacksonian era is, that we have these kind of expansions and then contractions of liberty. And so to me, this fulfillment of the promise of the revolution is something that we're still working toward,
Wow, I like that transition into the modern era. And the thing about our modern day is I actually thought about your class and your research. I was at Niagara Falls last year when my aunt and uncle came to visit from China. And oh my God, you look across Niagara Falls, you see the Canadian side and the crazy casinos being built by the Native Americans of Canada. And it's I guess the rights and regulations, etc., that govern the native lands, the reservations in Canada are more loose or something, because their casinos are much more big and glamorous than what I saw on the American side. So, because I remember in your class we read this book about the Pequots, I think, and how they started building casinos. So I was like, wow, I actually see this in Canada just looking across Niagara Falls.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's really interesting in the modern era has been the development of gaming, casino gaming, and other kinds of economic development incentives for, the Native nations are undertaking. And to be honest, I don't know, how the Canadian regulations might be different. I know that they're somewhat different, so I'm not really sure how their gaming works. But I know in the U.S., this is actually a question I get a lot, from students. Why do Native people have casinos? And basically, it's not because of race. It's actually because of their political status. Because from the beginning of the nation, beginning of the United States, they were always treated as separate nations. These treaties are nation-to-nation agreements, right? And so within those, Native people retain certain rights. And one of those is, as has been confirmed by numerous Supreme Court decisions, the right to pursue economic initiatives like gaming. And those, the particulars of that still have to be worked out state to state. But, that's where that comes from. And, I mean, essentially for Native people, many of them have been pushed into, marginal land bases. They're not on their original Native nations anymore. One of the things I talk about in the book is Indian removal. That's a big issue. So anyway, in these marginal economic spaces, they've tried to be really creative about development. And one of the solutions has been casinos.
Yeah. And one of the other interesting things about these casinos is that I'm talking, one of my other channels, I talked to this fight promoter. He and a Russian guy, they started a fight league in Latvia, which is 5 versus 5 team fighting of MMA. So imagine as close to a certified bar brawl as you can. It's the team of fights another team of 5 until the last man standing. You can gang up on other people. It's very brutal. And what they told me is, it's going to be impossible to bring it to the American mainstream sports market, but they could potentially bring it into the Indian country. And so they're trying to talk to I don't know which Indian country, which group, but maybe eventually they'll hold an event, some sort of 5-on-5 MMA fight in one of the reservations or something. I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it could happen. I don't know all the different initiatives that are happening right now, and that's certainly kind of a different one. I guess an unusual opportunity, but one of the other things that people are doing too is ecotourism. So that is actually increasingly common in the U.S. and Canada. So for Native people to lead people, tourists on canoe trips or hunting expeditions or things like that. So people are trying to be creative and trying to develop economic ties with colonizing powers, living together with neighbors, and that's kind of what's going on in the book too. I think so much in history we focus on conflict, but there's really so much collaboration.
That's true.
And, I think we often miss that.
So the school that you follow in Kentucky in your book, were the teachers whites, or were there mixed, Native American teachers and white teachers?
Yeah, that's a good question. Initially, the teachers are white, but over time, as some of the students graduate, they actually become teachers in the school.
Oh, that's cool.
So there's, and eventually the superintendent of the school is Native American. I think that, these kinds of schools, and especially this school, because Native people had gave all the money toward it, they had a lot of control. So we need to think about it, not just as a colonizing space, but also as an Indian space, a place where people really shaped it, and especially these people in leadership roles. And essentially part of what made the school fall apart was that Native people felt like their wishes weren't being respected there. You know, that, and that's why they pulled their money and their financial support eventually.
I see. And I assume because it's the Jackson era, there was a big reaction to the whole Trail of Tears incident, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, one of the really pivotal moments in this book is Indian removal. And I think, you know, typically in the U.S. we associate that with the Cherokees because, like, the Cherokees were very politically prominent. But actually this Indian removal was a blanket policy that was aimed at all Native people east of the Mississippi. And so that, you know, we're not just talking about Cherokees, they're also Seminoles and Shawnees and Miamis, and you know, dozens of different groups were forced to remove about 100,000 different Indians.
Wow.
So that's a big issue in the book because really one of the reasons why Native people were interested in going to this school was that they were trying to live peacefully together and they wanted to avoid something like this.
Exactly.
You know? So there's a real crisis that happens, you know, after removal. It's like, well, what's the point? Can we even live together? Like, should we even keep doing this?
I see.
Yeah, so it's a difficult thing. And ultimately, you know, what Native people decide is that they can't continue on with the school as it is. And one of the later chapters deals with their attempts to form their own public schools where they have more control.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the cool things that I discovered is that the school that I've been talking about is called Choctaw Academy because the Choctaws were the ones who co-founded it along with the federal government. And they're really interested in education. And after the school closes, they really formed the most broad and ambitious public school project in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. So that's where they were forced to move to. They provide free public schooling to everybody who wants to go, which is really revolutionary because at the time there were only 2 or 3 U.S. states that did that. And they even provide this opportunity to girls and women.
Wow.
So, you know, for them, they thought of themselves as very progressive, and the education was a really important part of who they were.
Yeah.
And they really still feel that way today.
So you got to talk to some of those people now, like sort of the descendants of that?
Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of research in Oklahoma, so I talked to some of the people who work at interpretive sites in the Choctaw Nation. So, like, some of their old schools are now owned by these different Indian nations, and also people who work in historic or cultural affairs within Indian governments. And so, yeah, I think it's, you know, important to kind of connect with descendants. And that was one of the coolest things about this project, is that I actually met descendants from kind of all 3 different communities: Native people, African Americans, and whites.
Wow. Just hearing you talk about how you did research just brings me so much joy. I remember just taking your class and having to do research, and it just, or just any political science, history, economics class, just being able to dig into the archives or talk to people. It's a different type of pleasure that I think a lot of people who haven't studied the liberal arts really have never experienced.
Yeah, I love research, and I think that's a really important skill that you can learn from history classes that it's kind of underappreciated, because I mean that's actually a thing that employers want, you know, like they want people to be able to do research and think independently and write, and that's really what history does. So I think it's for everybody, you know, whether you want to be a historian or not, you can use these skills for other things. And I find that, you know, one of the most surprising things that I found just as a teacher is, like, you know, first of all, research is pretty hard, right? It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's one of students' favorite things to do.
Yeah.
Because they feel like, you know, they're kind of detectives and they're investigating something, you know, and they're really discovering things. So, a lot of people really like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I was a junior, I had a political science class where I did some research. I did detective work. I was trying to figure out right when the stock markets crashed in '29 and Hoover was president, why did he pass a tariff law? When Hoover was supposed to be free markets, he was supposed to be the president that embraced capitalism and caused the Great Depression. So why was Hoover passing a tariff law, which is not free market at all? So I did a little research on that, and one of the things I found was that he wanted more presidential control of tariffs. It's called he wanted a flexible tariff provision in this law that Congress was passing. So he actually wanted to expand federal power, and it's like a part of the narrative that you don't hear, because you hear, Hoover was all about the status quo. FDR was about making the country slightly more progressive or socialist or whatever word you term for expanding big government. But it turns out Hoover was the same. So that was like another time I experienced that. Oh my God, I found something that it's almost like it was my first time finding that, and no one else has talked about it before.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about research, and I think the more as we kind of advance in these different levels of education, by the time you get to be in college, you learn things are really nuanced, just like you were saying, right? With these presidential politics, that it's not just one thing or the other, that it's complicated. But I think part of the joy and part of the reality of history is that it's complicated, right? It's never going to be an easy story. And it's not really a story of good guys and bad guys. I think that's often how history's made out to be. That's just, not a very interesting story, and it doesn't get us very far. I think for more complex history, we have to, it's more interesting to learn what are the roots of these different issues that we face, and if we look at those, how might that give us perspective today? Yeah,
exactly. So, Christina, tell me about your first book, because I remember back when I first started getting back in touch with you, you're like, yeah, my first book is coming out. So tell me about your first book.
Sure. My first book is called Slavery in Indian Country, and it was published by Harvard in 2010. It basically deals with captives and slaves in Native American communities from the pre-colonial era until the 1800s, and it really focuses on the Southeast. Something that's really changed the way we see early American history lately is the discovery that there were millions of Native American slaves in North and South America, that they were often Native American slaves who were taken even before Africans were imported to certain areas. So part of this project was discovering the roots of that, which really have to do with intertribal warfare and the exchange of captives. Another thing that's gotten a lot of interest recently was the fact that Native Americans also owned slaves. So they, later on in the 1800s, they owned African American slaves. And, if you go to northern Georgia today, you can see plantations owned by Cherokees who, these plantations look a lot like white plantations. And so this book kind of explains these different things. Well, how did Native Americans think about slavery over time, and how did it kind of change from a consequence of intertribal warfare to something that was more race-based and more economic in focus? So that's basically the first book. And again, this is something that still has consequences today, because just like in the U.S., these native nations deal with the aftermath of slavery, and slavery has really shaped how they see race too.
Yeah, I bet. And many of you watching probably are shocked that there were Native American groups that owned slaves, and it's something that I remember when I took Christina's class. I was shocked too. I was like, I believe we learned. I think it was when we studied the Indian removals, and a lot of these I believe it was the Cherokee who, they were trying so hard to try to integrate into American culture as much as they can. They even wrote their own constitution and everything. And it's like, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Christina, but a lot of these native nations, they own African slaves because they wanted to be like, sort of like white Americans. They wanted to show, hey, we're just like you, so stop treating us bad.
I would say, yeah. I mean, they definitely, I think that them writing their own constitutions, for example, kind of proves they didn't want to be members of the U.S., but they wanted to say, hey, we're your equals,
okay.
That we can kind of compete politically, and that would be what the Constitution was about, mm-hmm. and we can compete economically, and that's really what slavery was about, because, these Native nations were trying to become more economically self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. They were trying to engage in global markets and producing, staples like cotton, for example. That was one way that they could become, wealthy and economically competitive. So I think that's really how they saw it, that it was a kind of survival thing. It was trying to fight an increasingly strong U.S. with their own kind of economic and political projects.
Wow. And this is something that I just suddenly remembered, which is, so at my old job, I had a friend who grew up in Arizona, and there's a lot of Indian territory in Arizona, and he told me, like, he would go there sometimes, and, like, apparently, from what he said, the Indian territories were not the best place to live, and so there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of maybe even crime, and so, Is it the case that most Indian territory, because of the history of subjugation by, white Americans, that most of the Indian territory are still struggling?
Yeah, that is definitely true. Native people are still the poorest socioeconomic group in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And really, that has to do with the legacies of colonialism. It has to do with kind of pushing Native people onto the most marginal land. Yeah. And it also has to do with U.S. Indian policy, which is often very paternalistic and tries to kind of manage their, economic endeavors, mm-hmm. for example. So even sometimes when Native people have launched these more capitalistic endeavors, whether that's like, a fishery or an oil refinery or something, the federal government steps over and exerts control. Oh no! So it's led to a lot of poverty, and that's something that I think you're absolutely right to point out, because it's not a natural thing. It's not that Native people want to be poor. This is a condition that results from colonialism. Exactly. So reservations vary a lot, and I would say some of the greatest poverty is in the West, especially in these isolated, economically marginal communities where it's tough to find jobs, it's tough to get higher education, things like that. So some of these communities that have gaming, that have these more economic incentives or opportunities, they are sometimes more well off, but that does tend to be in the East or places that are closer to urban centers, that have good jobs and things like that.
I see. And the question that I suddenly was asking in my head was, so they're technically still considered like separate nations, but do they get to vote in the American elections?
That's a good question. The political status of Native people is pretty complicated, and it has changed over time. Mm-hmm. But beginning in, I think it was 1927, there was an Indian Citizenship Act that made Native American citizens of the U.S. And so, since then, they've been able to vote in federal elections. So they basically today have a kind of dual citizenship, mm-hmm. where they're citizens of their own Indian nations. They vote in tribal elections, for example, but they're also eligible to vote in U.S. elections. Mm-hmm. So that's really the best way to think about it.
That's interesting. Okay, because I was always wondering, because it seems like the territories that have or the states of the United States that have a lot of Indian territory usually vote red. They vote Republican. So this is actually a project I would love to do more research on. It's like, do most Indian territory, do they mostly vote for Republican candidates for president? That's something I don't know. I'm just throwing out like thoughts in my head right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's it varies quite a bit. You know, and you know, Native people are just like any other group in the U.S. I think there's just a ton of diversity in how they vote and how they worship and, you know, things like that. So there's no easy kind of answer. I would say that for a while, the Republican Party was definitely more popular among Native people, but that has changed quite a bit, especially since the 90s.
Okay. And it's diverse. It's something that I'm glad you pointed out, which is the diversity of it, because you know, I'm kind of talking about Native groups, Native territory is like one, but there's thousands, and I need to always remind myself, I need to remind my viewers too. It's like we like to lump Native Americans as a whole, but no, they're very different cultures, very different tribes, very different origins, very different oral histories, and you know, some of them weren't always getting along. And it's just like I made a video about this a while ago about lumping all Hispanics together when you think of them as a voting bloc. You know, Mexicans vote very different from Cubans, and then you can look at different age groups, income levels, etc. So it's just something always to keep in mind when you're doing any sort of like social science analysis is you can lump a group together, but make sure to break the group up too. It's like break them up by income, break them up by gender, sex, whatever the new term is, and gender, sex, etc. Break them up by you know, everything. So I'm glad you pointed that out, because in this discussion even sometimes I kind of like just speak for Natives as like one group.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think you're absolutely right to point that out. Like, the Native people are so diverse. You know, there's over 500 different nations in the U.S. today, and they all have their own, you know, language, culture, history. So that's one thing I really stress to my students too. That Native people have always been really diverse, and they're still diverse today.
Yeah. And this is something that I believe you brought up when I was in your class, but lacrosse, right? The sport that we always associate with white jocks. Lacrosse came from one or two Native American cultures, right?
Yeah, so lacrosse, it is kind of interesting, right? I think today it's kind of white. I don't know, it's often associated with white, more upper class folks, but lacrosse actually is a version of a Native American game, and these so-called stickball games, you know, games that are obviously played with sticks and balls, they were really widespread in Eastern North America and on the Great Plains, and they varied a little bit from tribe to tribe. Like, for example, in the Southeast, which is where most of the groups that I work with live, they actually held like 2 sticks. Each individual player would have 2 sticks. They're a little bit smaller, and that's how they played. But the version that we know as lacrosse actually came from the Iroquois, who lived in the Northeast. And lacrosse was the French word. You know, the French saw the Iroquois play this game, and so they came up with this term, and so that's really the version that's been popularized in American sports. And the Iroquois are still, you know, really amazing lacrosse players today, and a lot of these different tribal nations still have their own lacrosse games and leagues, and you know, they have festivals and things like that center around lacrosse, or you know, their own stickball sport. So it's still really vibrant today, and it used to be a game that was played to train warriors, you know, because it was very physical, required a lot of stamina. Of course, today it still has a lot of like those attributes, and it can even have spiritual kind of connotations. But in many tribes, it's also just recreational sports. It's you know, it's both this heritage element and it's healthy and fun. So it's kind of a cool story, and I think there are other things like that too that we don't always recognize. Native contributions to, you know, American culture and to global culture too.
Exactly, and it's it's just so fascinating when I learned that lacrosse came from the Iroquois because it's like it's just you always learn about, and this is something Pablo talked about in class a lot. It's just whenever two cultures meet, inevitably both cultures are going to pick up something from each other, and it's something that we don't emphasize enough. Like even for example, China and Japan traditionally, China was always sort of the awesome power. Japan was the power that was following, and then the roles switched a little after China became weak towards the tail end of its last dynasty, and then Japan started becoming imperialistic. And so there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of China's always like, yeah, Japan just copied us, so we never learned anything from Japan. But then I'm looking through the Chinese language. And the Chinese word for democracy, 民主, is actually borrowed from Japanese. And I'm like, holy shit, hey, see? China took something from Japan.
That's totally true. I mean, recently even, some anthropologists have critiqued the idea of culture, that it's this like discrete, separate groups that we can really, separate out and understand as being independent. Like actually, what we call culture is way messier than that, and people are always sharing culture, like borrowing different aspects, and I think one way you can see that recently in like popular culture and food scholarship is with food, right? That like where do these different ingredients come, how do they get combined? Well, that's the result of all this cultural sharing. So yeah, I think you're right that this like inevitably happens whenever people come into contact with one another, even when like power relations are very different. Yeah.
Quinoa, right? Quinoa is definitely it's native to America, right?
Yeah, it's native to
South America. Okay.
Quinoa, and I think I've heard that it used to be kind of it's an ancient food. It's a food that Incas used to eat. It obviously is very nutritious, but in South America, like more recently, it's been associated with like peasant food. As a food that lower classes ate, and so upper classes didn't necessarily eat it. But now, obviously, it's kind of a fancy food here in the U.S. and it's changed global prices, the global market for quinoa. So even those like peasants in South America, now quinoa has become more expensive for them, and so some of them are turning to corn, which is like a cheaper staple, So
Exactly.
It's really interesting that I think that these kind of different changes in markets or tastes can really have these global impacts,
Yeah. The other example I like to tell is similar to the quinoa used to be sort of peasant food thing, is organic stuff used to be considered like peasant food in China. And so, the rich people would eat the fatty meats, the rich people would eat the processed foods because that's, if they had money, they could get it. But now, because America's leading the charge for everything being organic, now all this stuff that in Chinese culture used to be associated with poor people is now, oh yeah, we got to eat organic too, it's healthy. So it's kind of shifting the global market. It's very much like the quinoa example in South America.
Wow, yeah, that's totally fascinating. It makes sense. I mean, I've heard a similar kind of story about if you're a historian and you read stuff about like Europeans or Euro-Americans, like in the 1700s, a lot of people had gout. A lot of rich people had gout. And it was because they ate way too much like fatty meat and they weren't eating enough vegetables.
Wow.
And actually peasants were eating way more vegetables. So in a way they had this healthier diet. So it's really weird how like things like fashion and class can really play into diet in ways that we might not expect.
Exactly. And then of course there's the example of kale, right? Kale used to not even be eaten by anyone. And then one day, I don't know, some genius decided, oh, this is very healthy. And then now kale, the worst tasting, worst chewing thing ever, is now like, it's even more considered like more healthy than quinoa or any of the grains.
Yeah, it's totally fascinating.
So, how many classes do you teach now, or do you focus most on research?
My regular teaching load is 2 courses per semester, and then Yeah, so I'm actually on sabbatical right now, which is great. So I'm just doing research, and I do research also during the summer. But yeah, and my courses at Indiana University, I teach mostly Native American studies and American history.
Oh, awesome. So you get to teach both sides of it, like the traditional American history, and then of course you incorporate Native elements, and then you teach a more focused Native American history class.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Native people are in all of my classes. You know, it's just, I would say that some of them are just really squarely focused on Native Americans, or even just different subsets of Native history. And then, yeah, some are more broad, and I focus mostly on early American history. So basically, you know, North America before 1850, roughly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, you know, this is thinking ahead, but do you have any other book ideas that you're gonna start on once this book promotion tour finishes, or are you gonna take a break from writing books? What's your plan next?
Well, I'm working on an article right now too, so that's kind of my current thing, and this actually takes me back to an earlier interest, which is mound building. So, basically, one of the things that I became interested in with this project is that often people, when they talk about the Trail of Tears and Indian removal, they often focus on kind of political aspects of it, or sometimes economic aspects, but not necessarily like religious things. Like, what does it mean to separate Native Americans from their sacred places, you know, from their mounds, which is where their ancestors are buried. These mounds often have really important places in their spirituality. So it's basically like taking Native Americans out of their Garden of Eden, you know, and so that's kind of what it explores. Like, what are the religious and ethical costs of, you know, forcing Native people into these new places? And so I look at it kind of historically, but also into the present, because there's some interesting movements where some Native nations have actually regained control of these mound sites.
Wow.
Or that they're like collaborating with archaeologists to interpret these mound sites and to have more access to them. So it's kind of cool, and that involves, you know, basically it combines different methods, which I also like, oral history, archaeology, and the historical documents. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Wow.
And I'll just see where it takes me. You know?
Exactly. When you were describing this, it reminded me of the movie Poltergeist, where at the end you find out, they removed the tombstones off all these native burial grounds, but didn't actually remove the bodies or transport the bodies. So the house was built on a Native American burial ground. I mean, you know, that's pop culture, but it's just, I don't know, I just got that image, and it's another example, going back to the discussion of how mainstream media kind of portrays Native culture, and it's definitely a very interesting twist at the end. It's like, oh yeah, you disturb the native lands, they haunt your house. It's so in a way, it's a little, I don't know how to describe it. A little what word am I looking for? A little simplistic or something like that.
Yeah, I do think that there is this, like, I think these kind of ghost stories are one way that, you know, colonial guilt plays itself out. You know, it's a way of, like, people recognize that this must have happened, but it hasn't been dealt with in a real way.
Yeah.
You know, like, there's been no, like, reconciliation. So I think that's where these ghost stories come from. I mean, so many of if you think about ghost stories in different places, a lot of them deal with either Native Americans or with African Americans in slavery. You know, so I think these are some of our big, like, kind of psychic wounds that have not been healed, and so people try to deal with them in other ways. And there's also, and this is something we talked about in your class back at Penn, but this is also a sort of like
taking that unfamiliar, since we're not as familiar with Native American cultures, let's say we're familiar with African American culture, or let's say even mainstream white culture, it's you take that kind of unknown, you take that excitement of that, like, this strange, and you can turn it into narratives. And that's maybe what they do with, like, movies like Poltergeist, or even like Stephen King's, one of his most famous books, Pet Sematary. It's all about, the premise of the book is you bury some dead body or dead animal, dead person in a Native American ancient burial ground, and he comes back. And that's also sort of like channeling that unknown, oh, it's a native culture, we don't know much about it, but, oh, it's kind of cool, oh, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm trying to look for the right sociology word for it, but you see that a lot with, when, not as much now, but back in the day when, let's say, any movie was set in China or India or something, it was always like the mystical stuff and like making up stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think people take a lot of kind of artistic license when they talk about native stuff. I mean, like, I think the latest example is like J.K. Rowling. I haven't actually read the latest kind of play, but as I understand it, she kind of fabricated a lot about native history and native culture. And, the thing is, like, I think you're right that it's kind of exoticized.
Exoticized, thank you, that's the word.
People, yeah, and I mean, that can do a lot of damage, actually. And I think that's one reason why history is so important, because, there are places you can actually go to learn about Native Americans, or you can talk to Native Americans today, right? They're around, and they don't want to be the objects of these, like, exoticized narratives. Like, they're people, they have their own stories to tell, and they don't want to be reduced to, kind of oddities from the past.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And when I think about sort of this exoticism / reduced to oddities in the past, it reminds me of this Tom and Jerry episode I saw back when I was in China. And it was like a Native American was chasing after Jerry, and he kept going. It was like that image still stuck to my mind. And as a little kid, when you're watching that, now you think of Native Americans, you think of right, and it does damage, especially if you come into contact with this kind of exoticized portrayal before you have enough brain power and maturity and rational development to be like, what is this? What is the motivation behind this? What are the situational cultural causes behind this portrayal?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think we don't realize how long that stuff stays with us and how deeply it can affect us. And so one of the things that I always ask students to do is to try to confront these popular culture stereotypes and to, in a way, put those aside when they try to study actual history, right? Like, because they're not helpful at all. And they can often really obstruct, learning real things about other people and other cultures. So, I mean, I think stereotypes, they're generalizations. A lot of stereotypes about Native Americans are bad generalizations. And, yeah, they tend to reduce people to really kind of narrow cubby holes, and all people are really complex. And so we have to... when we get to these higher levels of learning, we have to be open to that complexity.
Yeah. And I think what really helped in the class I had with you at Penn was that we had Pablo in our class. I mean, he was Mayan. So, like, he could give, like, a different perspective that like, I've never heard before, and he was also a social science student. So it's like it was kind of like, for example, in middle school they had a unit on China during world studies, and then, like, I was the Chinese person in class. So whenever we learned something, we could always be like, okay, how did you learn about it in China when you were in school? So it's cool, and that shows how important diversity is to the classroom. And I took a class. It was like another social science class. This could be another discussion for another time, but I'll just briefly talk about it. Junior year, and this professor from, I think, UNESCO, or maybe not UNESCO, one of these, like, international organizations, was talking about female genital cutting, and he was trying to equate it to foot binding, and in China, and his interpretation of foot binding was completely wrong. And again, when I say wrong, I mean he didn't understand how Chinese people perceived it. Maybe he was ultimately right in its aim, but the way Chinese people were taught about it, he couldn't even factor that in. And I just tried to very nicely bring it up because my great-grandmother was footbound, so I've seen her foot. I've seen how small it is. I personally have seen victims of foot binding, so to speak, and like people in class did not understand my view, and I had to write a very angry email to the whole class listserv and to the professor, trying to teach them in a very didactic way, which I shouldn't have. I should have been less angry, but I was like, okay, you think foot binding is weird? Let me bring up some beauty practices that Americans do that Chinese people could consider weird. And so I had a list of all these things that British people and Americans did either now or back in the day that were health destroying. And that changed a few minds. Like, oh, so maybe beauty standards aren't completely black and white. Some cultures perceive beauty a little differently, and it was like it needed that sort of tension from diversity to like get to a better place and move beyond ignorance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I remember Pablo too, and he was such a great student because I think he added a lot of perspective to the class.
Mm-hmm.
And he did his own research actually on Korea. I don't know if you remember that, but he was like doing, I think, his senior thesis on maybe like heritage architecture in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, but to go to your larger point, research shows that students of all backgrounds value diversity in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Because they know it enhances their learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how learning should be. It should be interactive. And, I think I always encourage students to have, they learn more actively when they contribute to discussion.
Mm-hmm.
They can sit there and listen to me talk and take notes, but there's going to be a much greater impact if they're actually interacting. And it's, as a teacher, I can say it's much more interesting for me too, and a lot more stimulating. So I think that's what university should be like.
Yeah. And the great thing about your class at Penn was that I think we only had 10 people. Maybe it was fewer than 10 people, but we had very few people. So if I weren't talking, you were talking, or Pablo was talking, someone had to be talking, or else the class would fall very, very dead. And with that small environment, it just felt more nurtured, and it just felt more, in depth.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that's something I've learned over the years is like if you have a small classroom, like especially I'd say less than 25 students, I think you can really affect like every student in there. Like student grades are better. It seems like they learn more. They feel more comfortable contributing. And so I think that's one of the, if we think about these like mega classrooms or like online learning, people are not going to have those experiences.
Yeah.
I think both of our experiences just bear that out. And, the research does too. Student grades are better. Teachers' evaluations are better. Everybody likes that.
Exactly.
Better. Yeah.
Exactly. So, okay, I will put an Amazon link to your 2 books. Do you have any other sort of links or any other topics you want to bring up while we're at it?
I don't think so. I think I have to take off, but
Okay.
I will also tell you I just posted a blog on Oxford Press's blog site. I can send it to you if you don't
please.
have it, but it's kind of like making comparisons between our own era, the comparisons between Trump and Andrew Jackson, which he's made, which other people have made, and I kind of connect that to the book. So that might be another thing, if your listeners are interested in, they could just click on and check out.
Perfect. Please send me that, and I'll put that in the video description. Let's end the conversation here, and let's definitely in the future have another conversation. Let's say if there's any development in your research, or there's any sort of questions my viewers might have. Maybe they have some questions they want to ask you. So how does that sound?
Sounds great. Thanks a lot. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. For those of you watching, please leave a comment. If you have any questions for her, please ask her in the comment section, or I can even give her college website so you can contact her directly. Is that okay, Christina, if they want to contact you directly?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Sure. And then press subscribe, press the like, and press the bell button so you know when I upload next. So again, Christina, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. It's great to talk to you.
Definitely. Pleasure's all mine.